Hello everybody. Today we will talk about ZeroLogon vulnerability. This is a vulnerability in the cryptography of Microsoft's NetLogon process, and it allows an attacker to impersonate any computer by attacking the Microsoft AD. In today's webcast, we have Mohammed Iqbal with threat prevention as an expertise and Saju Thomas from Threat Hunting Division. This webcast is recorded and you will be able to download today's webcast by clicking on the attachment. While Saju will talk about the solution, let's begin with Iqbal, who's going to talk about the vulnerability itself.
Hi all, we'll be talking about the ZeroLogon vulnerability today, which happens to be the talk of the cybersecurity world and has come to light almost about a year of the discovery of the NetLogon vulnerability. To understand this flaw, we'll need to understand a bit more about the underlying protocol and the authentication mechanism. Microsoft uses the NetLogon remote protocol, which is also called as the MSNRPC service, which is nothing but the remote procedural call that is made between the users and the other services for authentication within the domain. Well, understand this, that the information that has to be transmitted, it cannot be in a clear text form or a human readable format. It has to be in a secure format and it has to be encrypted. Now, to that extent, Microsoft utilizes the AES encryption standard based cipher called as AES CFB8, which stands for the 8-bit cipher feedback mode of operation. Well, under the hood, this cipher happens to have a certain bit of vulnerability due to which the whole cycle of things get broken down. Right. Now, there is a fundamental flaw within this protocol, within the usage of this mode of operation, due to which the vulnerability exists. Now, let's talk why the name ZeroLogon, right? Now, to the extent of the encryption cipher that has been utilized here, there happens to be a variable which is called the initialization vector, which is set to 0 or null all the time, surprisingly. And it should have been a random number, which is why it is called a ZeroLogon vulnerability. Let's talk a bit more about the vulnerability. Well, what is the vulnerability over here? Now, let's look at the working and how it has been called and what are the different sets of data that gets flown around. Now, in this particular case, as you can see, there is the plain text information, right? And this happens to be the IV value. The IV value, which is the initialization vector over here, is 0 the moment it is initialized. This is by design. This is by design of the compute netlogon credential function that is being utilized. Now, what happens here is that suppose you have a particular AES encryption key. You couple that value with the IV value. The resultant value based on the exclusive OR operation happens to be a 0 again, right? Now, this gets performed again, it's a 0 again. Now, what happens is that you repeat this a couple of times because of the 8-bit mode of operation. This is going to be an 8-bit 0, which is an absolute null, an absolute 0 as a result, which happens to be an issue at the core. Now, who are affected because of this vulnerability? It's all the Windows servers from 2008 R2 version and above. It doesn't mean that the older versions are not vulnerable. It's just that Microsoft doesn't support the older versions of the servers, due to which they have not listed them out. But if anyone is utilizing them, all of them have been utilizing the netlogon function for the purpose of authentication, and definitely they would be vulnerable as well. What about the non-Windows systems, right? Now, I did some investigation. I understand that the Red Hat Linux 6, 7, and 8, the SUSE Linux version 12 and above, the Ubuntu 16 series, the 18 series, the 20 series, and the Fedora 32-bit happens to be vulnerable as well. Now, this is just a sample list. It's not an exhaustive list. The vulnerability actually exists because of the configuration within the smb.conf file. If you set the client as channel parameter to yes or auto, it will be vulnerable because it utilizes the NetLogon protocol. Right? Now, when you set it to yes, it's mandatory to utilize the NetLogon protocol. But if you utilize auto, it may or may not utilize the NetLogon protocol. Going ahead, you would also want to check if this particular vulnerability exists on the Windows servers in your environment. For that purpose, Secura BV has released a Python script through GitHub that can help you test. For that purpose, you need Python, and you just need to fire up the Python script, which has the same name as the CVID, enter the host name, the service username, and the IP address. After you have successfully executed that, you should be able to get the status of that particular server if it can be compromised by the ZeroLogon attack or not. Now, we tried this out in the lab environment, and we were able to get a success read on this, meaning that this DC server would have been compromised by the ZeroLogon attack. In a similar fashion, you can also get a status through the vulnerability scanners that are available through Tenable, Nessus, and Qualys. They have plugins available for identifying the ZeroLogon attacks, and you should be able to get a status on that. Moving on, understand that this particular vulnerability can be exploited. The Mimikatz tool has a module called as LSA dump that can be utilized to perform this check. In this particular case, all you have to do is enter a couple of details like the account name, the name of the DC server, the host name, and certain other details, and it would give you a status. In this particular case, you can see that the 8-bit zero value is a result of the authentication, and it can be exploited, and it also shows you the status that it is vulnerable. Now, after this, it's just a matter of downloading all the hashes for all the users and going ahead for further compromise. Now, Saju has a bit more to talk about the solutions and detection mechanisms he would be taking on from here. Over to you, Saju.
Thanks, Iqbal, for giving us those in-detail understanding of ZeroLogon attack. It is interesting to see what's happening under the hood. What is the vulnerability? What are the exploits available? Now let's look at what are the solutions which we can implement today to protect our environment and prevent outages. Microsoft has released patches in a phased manner. Phase 1 was released in August 11, 2020, which ensures that the connection between the domain controllers are on secure and RPC. Now there would be many assets where this patch would have not rolled out, or there would be assets in the environment which are non-Windows domain controller, for which the OEM is yet to provide a patch. Now, to detect or to identify such assets in the environment, Microsoft has also released 5 different new system events which will assist in detecting all non-secure RPC connections. We'll talk about those events in the upcoming slide. So once you find those assets with the assistance of this event IDs, you will address those assets in either of the two ways. Either you will install the phase 1 patch, or Microsoft has released a group policy. This policy will ensure that non-Windows RPC connection from a trusted domain controller can be authenticated. Now, once that has been done, it's the phase 2 approach. The phase 2 is basically DC gets into an enforcement mode. We are expected to have that phase 2 patch by Feb 2021. So once that patch is installed, uh, there will be no non-secure RPC connection in the environment, provided the non-secure RPC connection is coming from those assets which is part of the group policy. Now let us look at 5 different events IDs which was introduced as part of phase 1 patch for ZeroNet Logon. These 5 different events will assist in detecting insecure remote connection attempt. So 5827 and 5828 you typically would see when there is a denial connection from an insecure RPC. 530 and 31 you should see in the logs when you have a successful connection from an insecure RPC, provided that that asset is part of the group policy, the exception group policy. 5829 is a denial from a vulnerable NetLogon connection. This event will get fade out post the enforcement mode is on by phase 2 patch update in February 2021. Now let us look at other ways to identify ZeroLogon attack. Most of the OEM providers for IPS and IDS has released their signatures and smart rules, which can be used as a detection mechanism at the network layer. The other way of doing it network layer is the packet analysis, because NetLogon as a protocol uses a specific functions. These functions which I've just explained, which I put as an example on this presentation, it's net server request challenge, net server authenticate. There's one more function which has been called. So if there are too many functions calls within a small duration of time, that should be one of the use case to see the potential not insecure RPC request happening at the network layer. The other way of doing is the behavioral part. Look for anything what a typically advisory would try to get into the system. So in this ZeroLogon, what we have understood is that the user is trying to spoof the credentials. So he is trying to exploit the vulnerabilities exploit the vulnerabilities of NetLogon. So you should see change related behavior on an account. So 4742 is the event ID we should look for, and as this is not been triggered by an admin, so the activity would be done by an anonymous is what it get logged off, what it will get logged. So look for those combinations. The other would be the post facto part, where once the attacker has successfully spoofed a user's credentials. Now, by just getting the user credentials is not what his ultimate goal would be. He would want to elevate his privileges, or do a lateral movement, or probably do credential harvesting or dumping. So look for those correlated events. Look for 4662. This is typically used or typically observed when there's an active directory change in the object. So with even if he is doing a credential dumping, then the user through which he is doing a credential dumping should also have those replication access events and so on. So look for those combinations events that should help, or at least gives us an understanding of possible attempt of this attack. So as stated previously, there are most of the IPS or IDS vendors have already released their snots or already released their signatures. So far, this was released as part of our research. We have come up with this snot rule for those entities who have yet to have this IPS or IDS getting released. You can have this part of your custom signatures. The details of the snot rule as well as the sample packet capture is available in the GitHub, shared on the link mentioned here. This is the last slide for the presentation. It's a reference section from where we have taken up the contents to make up the presentation. Thanks for watching the webinar. and have a great day.
Thank you very much, speakers, for sharing key insights on the topic. This concludes our webcast for today. Thank you very much for listening. Watch out for more updates on our social media websites like LinkedIn and Twitter. Stay tuned, and thank you again.